Hey there, this is Dan. You're watching The Salty Sea, and I am not a booktuber. You don't follow me for for any of my non-Warcry takes, but who cares? I'm a nerd. I'm sure most of the people watching this are nerds. So let's talk about some books. I'm gonna venture into art criticism for the first time, and let's just get into it. I am going to do a top seven for no particular reason. I read 14 books this year. I liked 13 of them. I read a lot of book reviews, so I rarely get one that I don't actually like. But seven just felt right as a cutoff, so I'm going with Legends and Lattes as my number seven. And this book is really fun. It's really short. So it just breezes by, and that's the point of it. The tagline is high fantasy, low stakes, and it really fits. The thing is just about opening a coffee shop, right? Maybe you read a lot of lit fic, and so it's just very intense, emotional things about our modern world. Or maybe you read a lot of fantasy, which is just a lot of, intense, again, violence, action, save the world kinds of stakes. None of that happens here. It's a really cozy D&D light world. Everything is kind of fun, quippy, happens with very little stress, and the way it's written just kind of eases you from scene to scene. And each conflict is just something like, hey, we have this good coffee, but hey, people are getting hungry. Will we find good snacks for them? And you would think that that wouldn't work, but you get kind of interested in worrying about whether this coffee shop is going to succeed. There are little details here and there that I would nitpick with if this were a book that was going for more tension, more sort of seriousness. There's a lot of issues that you could nitpick, but you just end up not wanting to because everything just kind of comes through like exhaling, and that's just such a nice breakup from everything else that I sort of read any recent time. My next one is Born to Run. This is kind of a classic book. This came out in the late 2000s and kind of took the world by storm. The main takeaway from it, basically the popular takeaway that a lot of people had, was that barefoot running was the way to do it, and all the modern running shoes, you just got to throw them out and buy new barefoot running shoes. And that's essentially been disproven scientifically, but it was always the wrong message to take away. It's such a funny American misinterpretation of something to go in with a book about indigenous people and about taking joy out of exercising, and to just make it into, hey, I'm supposed to buy X instead of Y. No, the point of this book is to sort of appreciate different ways of life, to appreciate the sort of empowering effect that finding a type of exercise that you love will have on not just the health of your body, but on just your love of life in general and your long term well being. All of that is done incredibly well in this book, even if, the final advice on what shoes to buy is essentially wrong. But the other thing that makes this book so incredible is just the way it's written. This is a better page turner than most sort of thriller novels that you'll ever read. Just the way that he writes is really incredibly done. Now, it is often pretty exaggerated. I was getting to this point kind of early in the novel where he was just making all these claims. Every time someone new would come on, he'd just give them all the most superlatives and all the most ridiculous sorts of introductions. And he finally got to this drink that these indigenous people make, and he kind of describes how they make it and says it's sort of the most incredible, intoxicating potion that, turns you into a super athlete the second you taste it, and you would think it'd be disgusting, but it's actually just goes down like fruit punch. And I go, this guy's crazy. So I actually made it, and it did taste incredible. It's called Iskiate. He describes it a little more complexly than it is. It's actually just chia seeds and limeade, which, when you describe it that way, it actually sounds delicious, and it is. But once I sort of cut through all of the hyperbolic BS of the book and then had this drink and really loved it, I kind of started reading the hyperbole differently, and it helped really take the messages from it that I think are healthier to actually take, as opposed to the ones that actually happened at the time. So if you're familiar with this book and you've stayed away from it because of all of the just incredibly annoying people who told you to buy weird shoes when this came out, give it a chance, because there's a lot more to it than just the public spectacle that it became. Now we're going more into my bread and butter, and The Ninth Reign by Jen Williams is really cool. It's an epic fantasy, but it's also a horror. And just think about like a lot of fantasy novels have weird things going on with the moon, right? Like George R. R. Martin in Game of Thrones, you never hear the moon mentioned because the world just doesn't have a moon. Or in Name of the Wind, there's obviously huge subplots to do with the moon. In The Ninth Reign, they all call it the corpse moon, and it's this dead body hanging in the sky, and everything is just given this layer of creepiness that I think really set this apart and made it memorable for me in a way that it might not have been otherwise, that a lot of sort of epic fantasy debuts don't always hit for me as intensely right away. And then the three main characters are all really compelling. I think that the villains, I could have asked a little bit more from them. I think their plots didn't really hit as hard as maybe they could have. I like a good villain, but the reason it didn't really matter for me that much in this book is that this author takes, let's say you're a fan of the Stormlight Archive, and one of the really interesting things about, that Brandon Sanderson epic is that the world itself is one of the obstacles. It's trying to kill you. There's, the storms going around and all of that. I felt like this novel did an even better job sort of making the world itself the source of conflict and the thing that you're worried about. And so your sense of narrative drive, your sense of conflict, your sense of dread was because all of these characters are struggling to survive in this horror world, such that you don't really need the villains that much. And then all of a sudden, the last sort of few chapters, the actual climax of the novel, just hits you really hard, where all of the horror themes of the world coalesce into an actual character that becomes something incredibly terrifying to deal with. And the kind of the visceral body horror of what goes on in that climax. I don't want to spoil anything, but this absolutely works as an epic fantasy, and I'm definitely going to read the second two novels in this series this year. So now I'm going to go into the Kaiju Preservation Society. It's by John Scalzi, and it's so much fun. It's on the surface, it's just sort of super scientists against the corrupt businessmen who fund them. Basically, there's a lot of fun that you can get into there as far as the nature of academic research and the way research is often funded, the way grants are given. But that's all like weird nerdy stuff that you can that you can basically ignore as you get into this massive monster movie of a book. It's actually a very short book, not a massive, but the monsters are massive. If you don't know, kaijus are sort of the term for giant monsters in, say, Godzilla or King Kong. And this is just kind of an ecological nerdgasm about sort of breaking out how they would actually function. It's a ton of fun. And it really works as just sort of, you can just blast through this as just a really fast paced, and it is. The pacing just keeps you going. I said Born to Run was an incredible page turner. This is an incredible page turner as well, in terms of the way it's paced and the way it keeps you moving. But you can also you can just enjoy it with your brain off, or you can really get into all the nerdery of it. And I just love that combination. So again, this is a nice and short book. So as far as I'm ranking these by how much I loved each book, but as far as how much I could recommend it, I would say this is one of the easiest to recommend that you could possibly see. I'm kind of bursting with excitement to talk about my top three, which could have been shuffled. But before I do that, I just want to get into a couple honorable mentions. The first one, if you are listening to this or watching this and thinking, man, I don't like this guy, I don't think his taste in books would be for me. I think an interesting book that you might like then is Noor by Nnedi Okorafor. This is a really interesting piece of Afrofuturism that I didn't really necessarily enjoy. The author does this incredible job and is so professional about like the themes of this book. It has a lot to say about body positivity, it has a lot to say about modernity versus traditionalism, and they're woven into every single scene with an incredible display of professionalism. For me, it felt a little bit almost soulless that I could see the themes being hit so hard in every scene. It felt like the narrative was serving the themes more than the. Anyway, there were things I didn't like about it, but I could not deny the kind of skill that it was done. One thing that I really appreciated, I'm kind of a tech pessimist. I think the last 15 years of technology, maybe not 15, maybe the last 10 years of technology have not been particularly positive. But Okorafor's version of Afrofuturism, where you see real, it's sober tech positivity or tech optimism, but it's a real tech optimism that isn't just listening to Mark Zuckerberg talk about how cool the metaverse is going to be and just knowing that he's full of it, right? It's actually a different version of what technology can do for us that was really interesting, and it makes me want to read other books by this author where maybe I'll enjoy the characters a little bit more. There were lines in the kind of introduction of the main character of this of I just want to be who I am and live my life. And like that's an actual pretty close to an actual line, and I was just thinking like, well, who doesn't? But the way the author kind of established everything and showed what they can do and what they can imagine made me really want to read another one by them. So if you're listening to me talk about books and think this guy doesn't know what he's talking about, you might actually really love this book because it's written really well. Now, I know a lot of people who follow me are here for the Warhammer, and the Black Library book that I read this year that made me reconsider what I think Warhammer books are capable of is Godsbane. I've had a tough time getting into Warhammer novels in general just because there's a lot of bolter porn. For those who don't know what that is, it's just like extremely purple descriptions of almost sometimes masturbatory descriptions of your weapons and the violence that you're going to do, where it's not necessarily the way Quentin Tarantino kind of shocked the world in terms of what violence can look like on screen and kind of changed people's opinions of what that can be like. It's not edgy or interesting violence, it's just a lot. And kind of described a lot. It's not even necessarily more violent than other things. It's just weird. Even as a lover of one of their smaller games, Warcry, their novel for Warcry just had a lot of that, but fantasy version, and it was not good. Godsbane really worked for me, though. There's a lot of kind of warhammering going on. I think they could have cut 20% of the actual pages in this book and had maybe a tighter narrative that would have hit a little harder. But what I loved about it is that they had one of my favorite villains that I've ever encountered in this scene, and who just really, really worked for me, felt like a natural response to the way their world and their overall lore works, and something where I can't believe that it hasn't been done in other books. And I really hope that the Order of the Black Sun comes back in future Warhammer novels, because I just think it's such a natural, they have such good points that are sort of obvious by the way that this world works that it's kind of shocking that they don't show up more. Overall, it's written in a way that is just really easy to listen to and was a really good time. So I'll definitely check out other Black Library books written by this author and see what it's like. Now let's get into my top three because I think all of these are absolutely fantastic. And the first one is The Philosopher's Flight. It's by Tom Miller. It's set in the early days of World War One, but with magic. It's a hard magic system, so anyone who loves sort of concrete rules and treating your magic like science, anyone who loves that is going to love this book because it's really intensely thought out. This person does have a science degree, so you can tell you can tell where they got some of these ideas from. But the other thing that's really incredible here, they take a lot of the best beats. I have read a lot of youngster goes off to magic school books, and I felt like I had read everything, right? There's the magicians who made it Harry Potter, but it's college, so they do drugs and have sex. Or, of course, HP, the series that will no longer be named. And lots of other kid goes off to magic school. I really didn't think that I could find new layers and new things to find interesting about it. And this book completely changed my opinion. It hits all of the best beats of that story while completely revolutionizing the dynamics at play. And I absolutely loved that. You can also tell the author has a lot to say about our world. I kind of don't want to spoil it and say exactly what the themes of this book are because they're so, I think they're just so well described in the way. The reason it hits so hard is because so fantasy in general and science fiction in general are really good places always to do allegory about our modern world and about imagining what a world could look like. But what's cool about historical fantasy when done like this is that you not only get to comment on our modern world, but you then get to kind of illustrate the perspective of how these issues and these themes have always been with us. And that can work really powerfully if it's done the way it's done in this book. And so the fact that you get this novel that is an adventure story with an awesome protagonist, I can't believe I've gotten this far without mentioning Robert Weeks, who some people are going to find this an annoying thing to say, but sometimes books that are just your basic white dude in a fantasy world, they can be a little, that main character can be a little bit blah, a little bit of a blank slate, someone who you don't really notice and eventually kind of feel bored by. Robert Weeks is not that. The author chose the perfect Montana mountain man to head to this magic school in New York City. And he is not a blank slate. He has incredibly interesting takes on the... Sorry, it's not New York City, it's Boston. But he has incredibly interesting takes on the city that's presented to him and the magic that he's trying to learn how to use and the people he encounters in his magic school. It's amazing. The fact that you can read this book as just an awesome adventure with a sweet main character, or you can read it as a commentary on our society, works really well. And you can just ignore the commentary if you're not interested in it and just have an awesome sort of magic school with a Montana guy and have a great time. So I loved this book, and I think you will too. All right, Nettle and Bone is amazing. So I read a bunch of, well, three different, this was sort of my subplot of my reading year this year, was reading a ton of gothic feminist fantasy. The Ninth Reign was another one of these. There's another one also that didn't make the list, but I did like quite a bit. But this is sort of creepy fairy tale core, where the author does this incredible job cutting and chopping bits of different fairy tales that you will be familiar with and creating a brand new story that still feels like a horror fairy tale, but doesn't actually follow the exact beats of any of them. Um, and by doing that, she's able to combine these tropes in a really new and interesting and fun way. Main character who's a princess, they have evil princes, they have charming princes, they have a knight in shining armor, they have a fairy godmother, they have a creepy witch necromancer. And in fact, I don't want to spoil anything, but the old lady magic users are incredible, and they get to meet and they have the most incredible repartee in between them. The fairy godmother and the creepy witch, just them bickering. I could read an entire book that was just the fairy godmother bickering with the creepy witch. Just give me a series that's just that, please. The author also does this thing. If you're going to write a story where you critique something, then it makes it a little bit more believable or a little more compelling if you also have sort of a positive response to that critique in your novel. And this author achieves that really well. There's this knight in shining armor character is really compelling and someone who I found kind of aspirational and really cool. I don't know why it's so hard for everyone to do this, but maybe it really is this hard, and that's what makes this book good. But when there's so many stories that you read, and not just fantasy or fairy tale stories, but just regular old Hollywood movies or literary fiction books, where the love interest or the wife or the husband is just not interesting and not compelling. Kingfisher gives the knight in shining armor is essentially the love interest of this story, gives him actual stuff to do that is really fun and felt badass. Like me reading it and the main character being someone who I didn't really wasn't me and didn't really relate to much. I actually did find the main character relatable and compelling for other reasons, but the fact that the love interest actually is a well-written, wholly realized character is just so funny that, like, why can't other people manage to have all of their characters or all of their main important characters be as compelling as this? Now, I could go on and on. I don't want to, because I'm really excited about my number one book, and this book is on a bunch of people's top 10 lists for the year. I've Googled top fantasy books 2022 a bunch of times while prepping for this video, and this book was on like half of them, maybe more. So you can read rave reviews for it in other places that are probably going to be more coherent than mine. So I just really want to talk about The Justice of Kings. This is going to go down as one of my favorite fantasy novels of all time. You know, maybe not in the top 3, but easily in the top 10. It's amazing. So it's a crossover of epic fantasy and detective noir. And I didn't even know that I needed that, but it is. So the way I discovered this was actually, if you've heard of the Greenbone saga or the Jade City is the book, all of the books have Jade in the title by Fonda Lee. Fonda Lee kind of took the fantasy world by storm with that series. And this was on just a list of a bunch of fantasy authors just saying what their favorite book they've recently read was. And I was like, well, I haven't actually read the Jade trilogy yet, but Fonda Lee, everything I've heard her say in interviews, I respect a ton. If she says that this is her favorite recent book she's read, I'll pick it up, I'll see it, because it sounded like it was up my alley. And I've got to say, it worked incredibly well. So first of all, as a whodunit, it works. It keeps you guessing until you do figure it out, in which case the drama goes from who did it to how are we possibly going to get enough evidence to get these guys. And while that's happening, you also have the backdrop of this epic fantasy where you get epic battles, you get sweet sword fights, you get a crazy magic system with uh, interesting ideas about the afterlife and sort of philosophy around that, which I found really compelling. But the other thing that's really amazing is that it's not just that you sort of get this crossover. It's not just the novelty of smushing them together. The author actually has interesting things to say about each of these genres. And if you liked, say, or if you've seen Dirty Harry or you've seen Judge Dredd, those are movies like I really enjoyed Dirty Harry the first time I watched it. And it wasn't until kind of after the movie was over and I was kind of reflecting back on it that it's like, oh wow, like this main character is actually almost as bad as the guys he's fighting. Like if you took him out of these extreme situations, he would actually be a horrible monster. And this book actually is aware of that. And so you get the kind of badassery of following Dirty Harry around, of following Judge Dredd around, but it's written through this incredible framing device of his assistant. The guy has the main character is a essentially justice who wanders this fantasy world, imposing the rule of law on the land, and he has two assistants essentially. One is kind of a hired sword who's just an incredible warrior, and one is his clerk. And his clerk is sort of being groomed to one day follow in his stead, and this whole story is the memoirs of the clerk. And you get this incredible way in which the framing device of doing this as a memoir and the clerk inserting their commentary into the story works to sort of bounce off what's happening in the events of the time. And it's honestly thrilling. This story has, yeah, I can barely describe it. And I think the reason I'm having such a hard time describing it is, you know, some of the some of the books that I've had here have had really great characters and have had really interesting bits of like social commentary along with their books. But this book manages to do the social commentary through the character work in a way that's really deft and really impressive. And there's a lot of sort of commentary going on. I think this works just as well on its commentary as the number three book, The Philosopher's Flight, just as well as that book does. But it also kind of has this incredible sort of whodunit plot and everything. I like this book so much I can barely kind of talk about it. So please give it a try. I think it's amazing. That's my full list. I'm really excited about these. Let me know if you have anything that you read this year that you thought was really really amazing or that might fit my tastes. Just really excited to go into 2023 with another year of reading, and I'll go back to Warcry stuff soon, I promise. So until then, may all your rolls be crits.